Hi there. The theme of World Book Day this year is empowering voices, and I've chosen to talk to you about one of my favourite authors, and that is the novelist Jane Austen. And Jane Austen is a writer who is very close to my heart for all sorts of reasons, and I've loved her for as long as I've loved reading literature, to be honest with you. Um, Also, of course, Jane Austen has given her name to one of the houses in school, Austen House. I happen to be the head of Austen House, as I hope you're aware. And what some of you might not be aware of is that we are also going to name one of the blocks, the block that's currently known as the English block, the English teaching block, as the Austen block, the Austen teaching suite or whatever. But so it seems quite apt to speak about Jane Austen at the moment. It may surprise many people to think of Jane Austen as a voice of empowerment, but I'm going to introduce her in a way that I hope that you will see that whilst not being what we would now refer to as an out and out feminist, because that she most certainly wasn't, Jane Austen was a woman who did speak out for the rest of her sex during her lifetime. She gave a voice to women at a time when women didn't really have much of a voice. She was born in December 1775 to a fairly middle class, well off family. She was seventh of eight children, but I don't think her family had any particular financial worries, which meant that she didn't feel the same sort of pressure, it appears, to marry as so many women and so many subjects of her novels seem to have felt at that time. Sadly, Jane Austen died in 1817, and if you've done the maths, that means she was only 42 when she died, which is an incredibly short life, and does make the impression that she's made on modern readers even more surprising for a woman who lived such a short amount of time to still be read and loved today is frankly quite incredible. As I said, she did give a voice to women at a time when there weren't really a lot of options available to women. So that when Jane Austen was alive, there was women had no formal education. There were no careers open to women. They certainly couldn't go on to university and study to join one of the professions. And this is why so many women at this time, and certainly the women in Jane Austen's novels, are desperate to get married. Or their parents are desperate to get them married off. And that's certainly the theme of many of her novels. And it's a particular theme in the novel that I'm going to read to you from today, which is probably her most famous novel, Pride and Prejudice. But before I come to that, I'd just talk a little bit about the way that Jane Austen was a trail maker in her time, because she did break with convention. She wrote at a time when writing wasn't considered to be something that it was acceptable for women to do. She wrote at a time when actually women who did want to write were considered, it was sort of a bit common. They were considered a bit lewd, not very respectable. And therefore, not surprisingly, any women who did feel this desire to write, to voice their feelings and their opinions at the time of Jane Austen, very often did so under a pen name, and the pen name they would choose would be a man's name, which is pretty incredible. When you imagine having to do that now, imagine if you wanted to achieve something, you, as a woman, you had to pretend to be a man to do it. Her first novel was Sense and Sensibility, and when that was published, it was only the second novel ever written by a woman. There was one other woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, who had also written a novel and wrote a lot about women's rights. So it was the second ever novel written by a woman, and Jane Austen published it simply as a novel by a lady. So she acknowledged that it was a female perspective, but she certainly didn't say who she was. She didn't write to be famous either, really. Jane Austen wrote for a small circle of friends and family, and fame was probably very far from her expectations. In fact, I would imagine she'd be pretty amazed if she had ever known how famous she would be hundreds of years after her death. As I said, I don't think you can over exaggerate how incredible that is. Um, there are several ways in which she acknowledges the how fresh what she was doing was, how new this was to give women a voice. One of the characters in her novel Persuasion, the main character Anne Elliot, actually says men have had the advantage of us in telling their own story. And by saying that, she's acknowledging that there is no shortage of stories told from a male perspective, a male point of view. But to actually hear a story from a woman's point of view, of the types of interests and concerns and worries that a woman experiences, was something quite new. So we were suddenly getting this perspective of a women's experience. In fact, it could be said that a man couldn't have written Jane Austen's novels. And that's probably why her novels have thrived for so long, because they are novels about women told from the experience of a woman. It might also surprise you to know that, and I think this illustrates how much this was about female concerns. Jane Austen grew up in a country which had been at war for many, many years. I'm trying to look for the quote that says this, because I had actually written it down. But she actually was born into a military family, and for most of her life, Britain had been involved in conflicts of various significance across the whole world. In fact, there was hardly a moment of Austen's life when her country wasn't at war. Her own brother, Charles Austen, had died during the Second Anglo-Burmese War. So she was aware that there was a world outside her cozy little female existence. But that's the world she didn't know anything about. And so that's not the world she tells us about. She tells us about a world that would otherwise have been pretty much hidden. It might be difficult for us to understand nowadays the importance of marriage during Jane Austen's day, but I have tried to explain to you that there were very few options open to women, and very often, without marriage, they would probably be destined to poverty, and would have had to live with that. I mean, Jane Austen was still living with her mother when she died. She predeceased her mother, because there was nowhere else for her to go outside the family home. So the excitement here of Mrs. Bennet at the end of sorry, at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, when a new family has come to town and there's an eligible bachelor, a man who might marry one of her daughters. You only understand it really when you think about what the world was like for young women at that time. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighbourhood, the truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he's considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "Oh, but it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Oh, why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week." "What is his name?" "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear. To be sure, a single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls!" "How so? How can it affect them?" "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet," replied his wife, "how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them." "Oh, is that his design in settling here?" "Design? Nonsense! How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes." "I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party." "Oh, my dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such cases a woman has not often much beauty to think of. But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighbourhood. It is more than I engaged for, I assure you." "But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on that account. For in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not." "You are over scrupulous, surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines for you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie." "I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is no bit better than the others, and I'm sure she's not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so humoured as Lydia. But you are always giving her the preference." "They have none of them much to recommend them," replied he. "They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters." And Lizzie is the heroine, the main character in Pride and Prejudice. And I will finish my note. It would be a very odd conversation to have, and there is a lot of irony, a lot of satire. The conversation there isn't entirely realistic, but it's written for the sake of humour. This lady's desperation to get rid of her 5 daughters to husbands. But I will leave you with a final note. Jane Austen's heroines are all strong women. They teach us to stand up for ourselves, stay true to our values, and speak our minds. And Elizabeth Bennet, in the young lady referred to there by the name of Lizzie, by her dad, certainly displays all of those qualities. And to me, that's as feminist as you can get. So, all right, Jane Austen didn't, her women probably to us seem rather tame, with their interest in households and getting married. But Jane Austen went against the norm to write and to publish novels. But her characters were characters with spirit. They were characters who did the best they could in the circumstances they found themselves, and they fought for their own right to happiness and their right to choose. And that is why I love Jane Austen.